2 Corinthians chapter 12. My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul discusses his experiences of visions and revelations from the Lord, along with his struggles and his interactions with the church in Corinth. Exegesis by sections and verses. Verses 1 to 5. Visions and revelations from the Lord. Paul begins by mentioning his willingness to boast, not for personal gain, but to share visions and revelations he has received from the Lord. He talks about being caught up to the third heaven, hearing inexpressible things in paradise. He emphasizes that whether this experience was in the body or not, only God knows. Verses 6 to 10. The thorn in the flesh, and God's grace is sufficient. Paul acknowledges that he could boast truthfully due to these revelations, but he refrains to prevent undue pride. He speaks about having a thorn in the flesh, which is a metaphor to describe a challenge he faces. He pleads with the Lord to remove this thorn in his flesh. But God responds by telling him that God's grace is sufficient, because His power is made perfect in our weakness. Paul then finds strength in his weaknesses. He says that in our weaknesses, Christ's power is evident. Verses 11 to 18. Paul's apostolic identity and ministry. Paul addresses the Corinthians' attitude toward him. He highlights his credentials as an apostle through the signs, wonders, and miracles that God performed. He contrasts his approach to his apostleship and uses hyperbole with those whom he calls super-apostles. Paul assures the Corinthians of his upcoming visit and his intent to be a blessing to them rather than a burden. Verses 19 to 21. Paul's concern for the spiritual health of the church in Corinth. Paul clarifies that his words are not a defense of himself, but are spoken for the strengthening of the Corinthian believers. He expresses concern that when he arrives, he might find divisions and sinful behavior among them. He sees the need to address these issues and humbly correct the situation. Overall summary. The passage captures Paul's complex relationship with the Corinthian believers. He reflects on his visions and revelations from the Lord. Yet his focus is on humility and acknowledging his weaknesses, as God's strength is magnified in them. Paul defends his apostolic authority and his actions among the Corinthians, emphasizing his service without being a burden to them. He desires their growth and unity, expressing concern about potential divisions and sinful behavior. The passage portrays Paul's deep commitment to the Corinthians' spiritual health and his reliance on God's grace and power.